Good morning. Everything good? Hope you're getting good through the Christmas time. Today I want to talk about archetypes. And what are they all about? You know, we all know that archetypes exist and they are everywhere. They are in your living room, they are in the stories that your kids play. They are in the toys, in the fairy tales, in every story. They are in our dreams, in our subconsciousness, and in the collective subconsciousness, of course. So, in other words, archetypes are everywhere. In the animal kingdom, they are everywhere. But what are they all about? And to get a glimpse about this, I want to look at Nietzsche and what Jung said about Nietzsche. And Nietzsche did not know about archetypes because Jung's psychology was developed later. But Nietzsche perfectly described the archetype of the sage as if he knew about it in his book Thus Spoke Zarathustra. So this is the archetype of the wise old man, the sage. I, by the way, would also argue that the book Zarathustra is a universal story and a precursor already for that movement that we see on YouTube. There is people who talk to the chosen ones or consider themselves chosen ones. They don't necessarily are religious people, but they have the kind of Christ consciousness, so they feel sometimes a connection to Jesus and God, and some read from the Bible, some don't. And there's even this number from the Bible, I think it's 144,000 chosen ones. And there's also a story from Arabic mystic, Sufi, about birds, 100 birds that gather together to find God, and only a small number makes it through this process. And this is also very similar to being called. You know, many are called but few are chosen. So a lot of people at some point in their life feel like they hear a calling, but not everybody is chosen. And to be chosen means to reach some sort of end of this journey. And you know, in this story with the birds, the main bird, by the way, is the Demiurg. I don't know the name of the Sufi that wrote this story in a moment. I could of course Google it. And yeah, it means that you feel a calling, you set on a journey, but not everybody can make it, and only if you make it, you're really chosen. You know, if you can answer the call correctly. And this reminds me of the archetype of the sage, and the archetype of the sage is represented in Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, okay? So, to be called or to feel a calling means that an archetype is reaching out for you. I always say, you don't choose an archetype, the archetype chooses you. And Nietzsche was obsessed with the archetype of the old wise man, and his book Zarathustra represents that, okay? And Jung said that it got pathologic, it was inflation of the ego, and it led to problems, probably to Nietzsche's downfall, because he was too obsessed with this archetype, and maybe he like felt that calling and got so obsessed with the calling that this journey has ripped Nietzsche apart, because he could not at all times be aligned with that archetype somehow. So was too much for him, so to speak. And Jung described it as I just did someone overtake me. He described it as an inflation. So when I say the archetype has to choose you, it means when you are put in a certain situation in life, all the life is about life. It's not about me making a video on YouTube or you watching a video. As long as we do this, nothing happens in our life. Okay? Life is about everyday life. Humble and meek, boring, everyday life. This is life, where it happens. And this is where an archetype can take over or reach out to you. And this happens through a situation where you're in, okay? When you're isolated and you're somewhere in a foreign, hostile environment, you have, you're outside in nature, you have to survive. Some kind of archetype between warrior, hunter, whatever will naturally take over. If you have it in you, it will take over. When you suddenly have to take care of children, no matter whether they are yours or not, a parental or maternal figure will take over. If you have the archetype of the father or the mother in you, it will take over when you are put in a situation where this is necessary, naturally. But when you feel this calling, it can happen that the picture arises, the vision, and then you perpetuate this. It means you start moving towards that archetype, and this is what happened with Nietzsche. Nietzsche felt the archetype of the wise old man, the sage, so strong. He perfectly described it in all its nuances, and he got obsessed with it, which means there was an inflation in his ego with an over-identification of this archetype. And this is where we see that it can be dangerous and unhealthy if you start to try to cater to the archetype. If not, as long as the archetype is taking you over and you don't think so much about it, it's just happening, that is a natural process. But when you start to feel you have to be that, it kind of becomes a obsession, then there will be dissonance between the reality and your imagined picture at some point, and this is painful. What you will then need is a fantasy defense mechanism, like in narcissism, a grandiose self-picture. And I believe Nietzsche would never allow himself to be fantasizing. So he rather break inside and mentally have a breakdown, meltdown, complete core meltdown, instead of fleeing into a psychotic state of fantasy defense. We also see the sage, the wise old man in the Lord of the Rings story, as the magicians. There are different magicians around Gandalf. there is Saruman, there is Radagast, and each magician is a representation of the sage. So they are subtypes of the sage archetype. And one of the good, the not evil magicians, I think his name is Radagast. He has got a bird under his head, and he's always in a good mood and talks to himself. So he is in a fantasy defense. He is a sage. He is an old wise man. He lives in the wood. He has a bird living under his head. But he's crazy. He lives in a fantasy world. But he is a part of this living world. Okay? So for him, it is in some way healthy to be crazy, to have a fantasy defense mechanism. He lives the role of the sage, and that's it, you know. But Nietzsche would never allow himself to do this. Nietzsche never pointed out to other people to make them responsible for his suffering. If he would have found pathological trait, if he would have analyzed the traits of the people that he admired, like Napoleon, Wagner, and others, he might have found out about narcissism and saw the weak spots about this. You know, these people are not only entitled, self-absorbed, have a grandiose sense of self. These people also have very toxic traits, and because Nietzsche never allowed himself to point out to others for his problems, miseries, whatever, he was looking at himself, and he also was not he did not allow himself to be fantasizing about things. He was almost in a notorious, unnerving way, self-observing, introspecting all in every second of his, you know, moment of his life, analyzing himself very critically. And yeah, I think this broke him, that he was obsessed with the archetype. Well, this is what Jung also said. He was obsessed with the archetype of the sage. It took him completely over. But at some point, he could not always cater to this very strong, overwhelming image. And it created a dissonance between his reality and the image of the archetype. And because Nietzsche did not allow himself to create a fantasy defense to kind of get his reality and the sage together in some form of harmony, this broke him. So we must be careful. Archetypes are not all good, all nice, and they also have nothing to do with if I create a video, if you watch a video, if we live in social media, has nothing to do with archetypes. Archetypes, for real only, they can choose you, they can call you, but you have then to answer the call. But don't get obsessed with them. It's like, you know, the Vikings were straightforward, heroic archetype. They wanted to die in battle, okay? They had a straightforward idea. I go into battle, I want to fight for glory, fame, whatever, and I want to die in time. If I don't die, would make me ashamed, I would have failed my life. So this is the archetype of the hero, straightforward, I want to die in battle. The Japanese samurai and ronin, Miyamoto Musashi, he was another archetype. He was the archetype of the warrior. And he studied life in a very pragmatic way, and he said, I will not have any favorite weapons. I will use whatever tool is the best, and I study the world to learn what tool at what time to use. And the result was, he was doing tons of duels in his life, and he survived all of them. He always won his duels. Thus, he is not a hero, but he is a warrior archetype, and he therefore could write a few books after his fulfillment, after his answering the call of the warrior archetype. He wrote books about his knowledge and stratagems and so on. Dokodo, the Book of the Five Rings, and so on. So these are different archetypes, and people answer the call. So see the difference between warriors who die in battle, heroes who die in battle, and warriors who have a bit of a different mindset and different approach. Yes. Because, I realized I make this video because I realized, archetypes, everybody talks about it. Chosen people feel like these are just things happening. It's a phenomenon, it's something that we encounter in life. But what does it mean for me? Well, do I use archetypes? Do archetypes use me? Is it just a fantasy? And I believe, again, the chosen, by the way, the chosen community, the idea of the chosen ones is an archetype, is a calling of an archetype. For most of them, it is probably a subtype of the sage, but it could be different for some people. And also, it needs a lot of realistic background, I believe, to be healthy. And this is why I say we don't choose the archetype, When children play, they are in fantasy. Every fantasy is a defense mechanism, and for children it's healthy to do this because it creates the feeling of security around them and gives them the time and space to develop their personality. And when they play, they get to know different archetypes because they play magician, they play warrior, they play hero, they play knight, they play gangsters and police, whatever they play, or they play different animals or monsters or whatever, and these are all archetypes, okay? So they start introducing this and they learn this in a fantasy way. But there's a preparation for real life. All play, all playfulness, all fantasy is a preparation for the real life, and in real life there must be an alignment between what you live in your everyday, in your boring life, in your real life, not your online life. There must be an alignment between the reality you live and the archetype that is calling you, and that maybe you realize it, you're aware of it, and you fulfill this archetype. But if you get too obsessed with the archetype, like a child that desperately always wants to play the magician or the knight or whatever, there will be a cognitive dissonance between the archetype, the image of the archetype that you fell in love with too much, and the reality of your life, and there is this distance, this dissonance. And therefore, you must create a fantasy defense to wrap it up. And maybe in some cases this can work in a kind of healthy way, in a stabilizing way, just like with Radagast, the little bit crazy good magician that is established and validated by all the trees in the forest. But it can also become dangerous then when you are kind of try to entertain this inflated archetype that you cannot represent in reality at all times. There's different dangers about this. And one danger again is that you might need a fantasy defense, and fantasy is always dangerous because it can let you lose grip to reality. And the other danger is that when you see the difference between the archetype that you created in your fantasy that you want to live up to, you start suffering if you cannot fulfill the picture the way you want to. And this can lead to unhappiness, or what we saw in Nietzsche is a breakdown because he did not allow himself to both be divergent to his image as well as finding a defensive fantasy to make up for that. So so that you know it, archetypes can help you in this nihilistic world. Nihilism is rational. Nihilism is real. You know, when you think only rational, yes, there is no external purpose for your life. There is no external God waiting for you to make up for everything that went wrong in your life. Yes, it's not there. But there are archetypes. There are patterns that are very real and that can help you to find a role in your life that can give you purpose, that can give you content like archetypes. When you hear the call, you can follow that call, but there's also dangers to it, alright? So I just want to give that to you because everybody talks about archetypes. We don't, everybody talks about chosen ones. What is that? What does it mean? Where is reality? Where is imagination? Where is fantasy defense? How do we deal with that? What are the dangers? And so on. That being said, stay safe and I'm out.